Thank you all for coming. And yeah, the numbers game we were playing, it's 20 years since I left Oxford. So I've been doing other things, but I was here for 20 years. So it's kind of important for me to have an opportunity to really share with you how I got an education, because when I became director of this place, I think I was 27, in 1976, one of the first things I realized, with some horror, was I didn't know very much. Didn't know very much about contemporary art. Particularly as contemporary art is in a constant process of becoming, so you can never quite pin it down. But you can get the smell of the beast. And getting the smell of the beast and the size of the beast and the feeling of what it really is, I've been doing ever since. And one of the main ways in which I've done this, is this idea of alterity. Alterity is something else. It's the basis of comparison, which is those of you who are art historians. I started off as a historian, a labor historian, and then converted into art history. Is you have to compare things to sort of find out matters of truth, but also qualitative ideas. So it's no point in just saying, oh, that person is a genius. You have to prove that he's a genius or she's a genius, come forbid, that she's a genius in the context of other artists working at that time. So words like genius I really don't like. It's like having a huge box of chocolates and choosing one and sticking it in your mouth after a moment. But art isn't like that. And culture's not like that. It's a big network. And very often, artists are like us all. They don't quite know what it is that they do. Particularly until they've finished it. But even when they've finished it, they sometimes don't know what they've done. Because they've got involved in a very powerful activity. And how I got involved in this whole affair was as an undergraduate. I decided for complicated reasons that I wanted to make a series of art exhibitions. And these exhibitions were related to German art and society from 1900 to 1933. And I'd realized growing up, and that my parents had emigre friends, and these friends actually had art on their walls. Had no idea what it was, but it stuck in my mind. And I learned subsequently there was some Nolder and Heckel and rather good expressionists. But I'd also learned that these were artists, amongst many others, whom the Nazis hated, and they destroyed them. They called them degenerate, and they regarded them as symptomatic of a whole lot of human ills. Well, if this was degeneracy, I just felt I want to have as much of this as I can. And I've been spooning it up ever since. And it's that power of art, which is actually outside the hands of the artist, except that there's this autonomy. You can go into it. There's no total autonomy, but good enough autonomy. The sense of freedom, the sense of consciousness and conscience, which have become part of what we describe as modern art, and even into the contemporary period. And so, for me, contemporary art is one of the few areas of activity where no one is telling you or implying what you should think or feel about it. It's not true it's certainly not true in religion. It's certainly not true when you read the newspaper, with the exception perhaps of the dear old Guardian, but still they're a bit preachy. There's so many vested interests. And the artist has no interest other, if they're any good, I'm only talking about good artists, no other interest than in making as good a work as they can. That's their only interest. If they have any other, they're a creep. So, this whole discussion about goodness, other things, alterity is really what has been occupying me for quite a long time. So Clint Eastwood once famously said there's two kinds of curators in this world. There are those who believe there are only a very limited of good artists in the world and a very limited number of good places in the world where good art is made, and that the discourse is limited. But the other kind of curator, Clint referred to, was completely different. He said, no, probably good art is being made all over the world. We just don't know about it. And actually, art is an absolutely basic and essential part of the fabric of human culture. And if we begin to learn about it, because we're not born knowing about art, if we begin to learn about it, we'll then begin to learn about whether what we're looking at, what we're experiencing, is any good or not. So in 1976, when I came to Oxford, I was a little bit unsure. I mean, one of the first exhibitions I did was of drawings by Donald Judd, which we took from the Kunsthalle in Basel. And I was interested in Judd in many ways, partly because I could see him as part of a continuum from Russian Constructivism. That was one of the things. And also, everyone was talking about American art at that time. I'd never been to America in 1976. And it seemed to me to be someone who would be really worth having a look at. And when you start, you have no program. You've got to work out. There really was no program. So work out the first 18 months ahead. You know, that was one of the people I put in. David Everson, who was a steel sculptor working with Anthony Caro, was another. And there are a few others. Now, talking about American art, I was really interested in this relationship between abstract expressionism and minimalism, and what was happening now. And so did a series of exhibitions, which had in the top gallery, you can see here, Frank Stella. It was the first European showing of his exotic birds in '76. He made them that year, and that autumn they came here. But underneath was Solowitz incomplete open cubes, both in the small versions and a few larger ones. And then in the basement were some were watercolors by Hans Hofmann from the early 50s. So Hofmann in the early 50s was making drip painting. Now, if you read the history books, everyone says that it was Jackson Pollock who first made drip painting. Of course he didn't. I mean, and who did he study with? Who were the influences on Pollock? Hans Hofmann. He went with his wife, Lise Krasner, and worked with Hofmann. And also he was deeply, deeply impressed by Jose Clemente Orozco, a Mexican, about whom more later. But this was a performance made at the time of these exhibitions by Sally Potter, Rose English, and Jackie Lansley, called Mounting. That's rather a sort of male term. And this is really one of the things that was happening at that time. And it was the opening up of art made by women and the critique of other art, which was incredibly important. And subsequently, I began to realize that this was part of a general discussion about a kind of intellectual colonialism, which went right across the whole of culture. But this performance that they made and the book, in which Rose English dressed up and put her horse things on and clip-clopped across the gallery, and it was either Sally Potter or Jackie Lansley was pretending to be Clint Eastwood in the top galleries in front of Frank Stella's installations. Somehow, looking back 40 years, strikes a very strong chord. This was another exhibition of that time, sort of, made in '77. Joe Baer, who was the so-called minimalist group of artists, was the only woman. And then the show we took from the ICA. There's lots of political discussion about it in the press, about dirty nappies and all the rest of it. But, seems pretty bland stuff now. And then picking up on Donald Judd, I mean, the Russia, the Soviet Union, I mean, Constructivism, the history of Constructivism. We were lucky enough to be able to get this show together in 1977. And Lisitsky, who was the assistant of Kazimir Malevich in Vitebsk, in the art school in Vitebsk, and a trained architect, what he brought to Malevich was a three-dimensionality to the flat floating planes in space that Malevich was making. So in other words, he turned them into architecture. You see it in one of these works from 1919, 1920, called Project for the Affirmation of the New. But he described them as floating space stations. So they were not only in another dimension, in the fourth dimension, they were actually floating out there in outer space, which I was probably doing as well, actually. But another aspect of alterity is looking at things which perhaps aren't art at all. And here's it's a rather grim little catalogue, but it was a very interesting exhibition of work made in psychiatric hospitals. So partly it was made for therapeutic purposes, but it was also art made by mad people. And we'd worked with a number of doctors and therapists with this who were making comments about things, but discovered in the Maudsley Hospital this strange collection of art that they'd put together. And what one find is this amazing work by Václav Nijinsky, who you probably, the dancer in the Diaghilev ballets, who actually died crazy, spent his last 30 years in an asylum, and obsessed by Diaghilev, his master, the portrait of. So that was just one floor up, along with many other things. But other things that weren't art, and looking at advertising, propaganda, seemed to be more or less the same thing. This exhibition called The Falling Leaf, which was a history of things that one side had dropped out of aeroplanes onto the other side. Since they first started doing it in 1914, it was D'Annunzio, the Italian poet, who did it, going over Trieste, and until the Vietnamese War. And this was all from one collection, from the general director of the Psy War Society, whose name was Reg Auckland, and he ran a post office in St. Albans. It was a wonderful collection. And there's some of the Second World War, just an example. And at the same time, I mean, looking at words and how words are put together and meanings, I mean, some people said at the time a little bit cruelly, we showed Joseph Cassuth, the one person, which is looking at language from a totally different philosophical, linguistic point of view, linguistically philosophical point of view. And at the same time, Hans Harker, a conceptual artist of a completely different hue, was someone who was engaged with systems, initially with natural systems of condensation and evaporation and of wind and then deflation, but then looking at social and political systems. And he came and did an exhibition here, and the work he made specially was with British Leyland. And it's now in the Tate. It took them, I think, 15 years to buy it, but is now in the Tate. And it's called A Breed Apart. The title is taken from British Leyland advertising in South Africa for their new Jaguar, and it was for the man who was a breed apart. The other part, which you can see with the logo, Leyland Vehicles, Nothing Can Stop Us Now, was from British Leyland, and it was about their heavy trucks. And it was really looking at the apartheid and the breaking of UN regulations against the supplying of quasi-military or military equipment to the South African government. So there you see the Jaguar as it's being marketed in South Africa, and there you see the Land Rover as it's being used in Sharpeville and other places. So of course there were other things going in between these exhibitions. I mean, British artists, some of them from not so far away, some of them in this room, and other artists, but I'm kind of showing you these far touch points of alterity. So the exhibition of Rodchenko was really the first one that it was possible to borrow from a private collection in the Soviet Union, which is Rodchenko's family's collection. Until then, officially, there weren't supposed to be private collections, but anyway, we got through it. And so the first exhibition of all of Rodchenko's work ever to take place took place here in Oxford in 1979. Photography could have been shown before and bits and bobs, but it wasn't all put together. You can see I was working, or have been working with some good designers. This is David King. The previous Lisitsky catalogue was by Richard Hollis. So we just flick through. These are works which are actually shown here. Including that photograph of dear old Lily, who was one of Rodchenko's friends, just to show they weren't so buttoned up, you know. And the reason it's so overexposed, it's the only way you could get the see-through effect. It was Lily's boyfriend. And here's a painting that Rodchenko made in 1943 called Expressive Rhythm, or at least that's what the family called it. But it's nearly 2 meters long, and it doesn't fit into Constructivism at all. And where the hell is this coming from? Well, anyway, that's a big question. But the exhibition that followed immediately after that, of like flagging out, and as you can see, I'm from Museum of Modern Art. I mean, it no longer exists. It's a bit like Czechoslovakia or the USSR. But anyway, it meant something at the time that as people active in the present, of course we're formed by our past. And we will change the future in the same way. We're a membrane between past and future. So this chap really was fascinating me for lots of reasons, and with the Museum of Modern Art in New York, we made this exhibition. And Richard Hollis was the designer. So Orozco, one of the artists who Pollock loved and got him going, even before he started making his psychoanalytical drawings, no one had a clue about Mexican art in Britain. And how did I get to know about it? Through Pollock. And also through Mayakovsky, because Mayakovsky went to Mexico. And I discovered that this guy was working, showing Mexican history for a newly formed Mexican state, not a colonialist or colonialized state, was someone who wanted to show revolution. But it wasn't a heroic view of revolution. It was actually showing what a cruel and horrible and destructive thing it was. This is a whole cycle of murals he made in between 23 and 26. So Pizarro and Malinche, this colonial and Indian woman who he made kind of wife. Liberty and the False Leaders. So what happens after the colonization? The revolution itself. That painting was here. And the scrap heap of ideologies, an incredible statement for 1923 to 25, where you not only see the Jacobin cap, the French Revolution, you see the Italian fasces, the German swastika on a charnel heap. This is in New York in the New School. And he revisits this theme in 1936 in Guadalajara, the battle of ideologies. So from the distance of Mexico, of Guadalajara, Orozco is looking at Europe. And he's as horrified by what he sees there as by what he saw and experienced himself during the Mexican Revolution. And the Man of Fire, the cupola of this huge series in the Hospicio Cabañas in Guadalajara. And that was one of the images that Pollock really remembered and was inspired by. We did a building project in 1980-81 and reopened with Leon Kossoff. So, as I said, just a touch that we are doing other things in between. And then come back to Mayakovsky. Not just a glorification of this incredible character, but it was 20 years of work, an exhibition he himself organized in 1930, when he was being criticized severely by, not directly by the party, but by the proletarian organizations which were being organized by the party to do that. So he was really the first to realize the game was up. Autonomy out the window. But also he was a poet. He was also working with Rodchenko on advertising jingles. So these are little ideas for one of the new state department stores. Only one thing remains to us from the old world. That is papyrosy, era. Navi astan layutsa od starava mira tolko papyrosy mira, era. So that kind of rhymes, even with my crappy scanning. Nigde krome kappa muscle-promie. Nowhere else but in muscle-prom. So in 1923, you're getting jingles. You're getting advertising jingles for state, not private enterprises. And of course, there was a battle going on between the state organizations and the private ones, which are still approved at that time. And there you can see it splattered on the side of the muscle prom department store. Again, they worked together on selling galoshes in Azerbaijan. And as well as being a public poet, a political poet, he was also a great lyric poet, a poet about love. And this is about this. Here Lily reappears, and it's a story about their constantly troubled love affair. And there he is at the opening of his exhibition, 20 years of work. After it showed in Moscow and Leningrad, and after that he shortly committed suicide afterwards, partly because of a love affair which had gone wrong, but certainly for other reasons as well. But just to quickly nip back here, we did two catalogues for this exhibition. I mean, one is a kind of insert to the other. But it was a tradition, working with David King, that we'd always put Trotsky in one of the publications, because it really irritated the Russians, because he wasn't in the great Soviet encyclopedia. But if we irritated them too much, they wouldn't let us borrow the work. So we did, this was the official one without Trotsky, and then there was one which had lots of articles and things which had Trotsky in it. So it's a real collector's item. But then kind of stepping outside, like the alterity of East-West Cold War, moving towards completely outside. This series of exhibitions which are made with Ibrahim Al-Kazi and Victor Musgrave in 1982 covered three areas. One was folk art, and I mean, folk art is so picturesque in Britain and in most of Western Europe, but it is obviously very strong in other places. And what I was fascinated by was how strong folk art was in India. And this is an analysis of gods in Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan. And we're putting that together with film posters. The film posters were down here. And Peter Kinley, a very, very good artist who'd also traveled a certain amount in India. So there was some influence, but it was not an obvious one. And cinema and documentaries and all the rest of it. But there's one of the little fellows. He's a god, kind of Mataji, mother goddess figure. I mean, such strange, one could say surreal objects, but photography, young photographers working in different ways in India. Pablo Bartholomew. Of course, this was a lot of India's view of the West. I mean, thousands of hippies had gone over. Foynesson. And then modern art, a kind of potted history from the Bombay progressives in the early 40s to what was happening then. And this was really way out of the scale to do this at that time. I mean, contemporary art, modern art, was things done in Western Europe and North America. And it was almost laughable to suggest there was anything worth looking at outside this. But I'm glad we did. This is Subramaniam, K.G. Subramaniam, sadly just passed away 2 months ago. And it's one of his works made in response to the Bangladeshi war in 1970, 71. The Tea of Mehta, a work of 1956. Really a great work. Obviously there's a debt to Picasso there, but the Tide Bull, Hindu symbol. So happens that Mehta is not Hindu, or was not Hindu. He also has passed away. But at that time it didn't matter. Today, to do a Tide Bull, I mean, you'd have riots in the streets. There would be people killed. As indeed M.F. Hussain found out, because he also, he's one of the Bombay progressives, and his rendition of Hindu deities in a kind of modernist way really felt to be offensive, and he had to move and live in Dubai, of all places, poor man, for the last 3 or 4 years of his life. Well, Francis Newton Sousa, family from Goa, as you know, was a Portuguese colony, so I mean, a lot of Christian iconography comes up in his work. The Vatican didn't object, I'm glad to say. Bikash Bhattacharjee, who's a Calcutta-based artist, his view, rather sardonic view of Western hippies as they're constantly trotting their way through. So Hussain was good enough to come one Saturday morning and make a work. And you could just sort of stroll in. It wasn't kind of like going to the zoo or anything. It was completely natural for him to do that. He wanted to do it. And he brought a bevy of female supporters with him as well. And it's a building where artists often have worked. I mean, John Walker had what is now the John Piper Gallery. He was using it as a studio. And you'll see some other examples in a moment. So, this designer, Malcolm Garrett, another very interesting guy, who used to do all the graphics for Boy George and Culture Club. Anyway, he did the story of the Artists International Association, 1933 to 53, which is when it continued into the 70s, but then it fell apart, I mean, because of what was happening in Eastern Europe. But it was the left front organization. So Lawrence Gowing, Henry Moore, every artist who regarded himself as an artist was a member of it at that time. There's even Dame Laura Knight, Ruby Loftus screwing a breech ring, as you can see up the top there, and lots of people. Could do with a little bit more of that now, perhaps. And I really did do something other than Russian exhibitions, but I mean, a lot of people thought I didn't. Art into Production, which was really looking at the luxury side of the Soviet exercise, bringing together again folk art and modern ideas. Long live the Council of Soviets. Save the starving in the Volga region, so it's 1921 when there's a huge Volga famine. Nicholas Suetin was one of the Malevich circle. and then in the fabrics as well. Now, these are things which hadn't been widely seen in the USSR itself. And I mean, Rodchenko was a persona non grata at this time. So there'd been one publication on the fabrics, but nothing, very small run. So no exhibition. So it was really putting together these things for the first time and actually showing this incredible energy, incredible design energy. And I think a lot of British designers picked up on this. I mean, sort of aeroplanes, and then there's cotton picking down in there. I could talk about Germany. Let's give it a miss. Thinking about the contemporary Russian situation, though, there are these words, dissident, which is always a very problematic term, non-official, a little bit easier, artists who didn't go along with the system, and this is works made by Komar and Melamid, who failed to go along with the system so much that they left in the early 1980s and settled in New York. But really to reflect on the traditional aspects of Russian art in this exhibition. 30 years ago, a painting showing how people greeted the death of Stalin when it was announced. The cliches are, everyone cried when it was announced on the railway. Actually showing two teenagers really having a great time. The origins of socialist realism, and then what is to be done, Что делать? Title of a social novel from the 1860s and the pamphlet by Lenin, and what is to, it's one of these great sort of political statements about Soviet and Russian Slavic angst. But as a kind of palate cleanser to all of this, again, stepping outside into another cultural tradition entirely. I mean, obviously with India, we're talking about at least 5,000 or 6,000 years continuously of culture, which we don't have to that extent. And really seeing how people dealt with it there. And of course, India had been colonized by Britain, so there was that difficulty, that sense of unease there, which one could feel. With Japan, I mean, there'd been this war, and I was working with a researcher called Kazu Kaido here in Oxford, and she was focusing on this period and started to show me some of the images. I thought, this is just incredible. And to have a main exhibition of avant-garde art in Japan, but also photography, and then a small thing on Dada in Japan, plus films, at putting story together. Now, this is a shot of a reconstruction of part of this exhibition I made in Tokyo, in an exhibition called Berlin, Tokyo, Tokyo, Berlin, where it's focusing on the immediate after-war years. And this, Fukuzawa Ichiro was here. It's actually based on a famous Russian painting made in the 1870s by a painter called Vereshchagin, which is a pile of skulls. But Fukuzawa has made this of corpses. He'd been imprisoned during the war for not being the right kind of Japanese. Yamashita Kikuji's exhibition of, painting about violence, landlord violence against tenant farmers in rural Japan in the early mid-50s, very, very strong. And you can see that surrealism was very well implanted there, and a number of artists had been working in Paris before the war. And also how artists began to work with it by themselves, partly cut off, but not so cut off. And Onkawara, you probably know him most of all as a conceptual artist, but this is a painting made in 1955, and it's of a GI from below, and shaped painting. And the Neo-Dada organizers. So quick shots of Kusama Yayoi there in the right hand, and Domoto and Shinohara and all these other characters. So a big range of different things which are happening, including the Gutai group in Japan from 45 to 65. And actually putting it together, not just sort of dropping it, parachuting it down, but actually giving a story of how these things related together and to other things that were going on. And as 1985 was the 40th anniversary of dropping the bomb on Hiroshima, and there was a lot of anxiety and, about cruise missiles being put in England at that time, we did something which wasn't art as well. It was a series of paintings by Hibakusha, survivors of the atom bomb in Hiroshima. And it's naive art, almost like children, but important too. And then back to Mexico. Margaret Thatcher was one of the Committee of Honor for this, because the Mexican president was on the Committee of Honor, and he was making a state visit. So I just loved it that she was land and liberty. Great lessons for politicians. It was Carranza who was the president. Tagore, Sunuljana. Subramaniam came and did a residency here, and he was up in the tower. That was his studio. And he made these works based on color gut paintings, which are also, they're actually on perspex, but they're also relating to traditional glass paintings in India. And very much reflecting his experiences while he had this residency. So, dropping out different markers as going through this program. One of the big question marks was Africa. I mean, we've been dabbling in Asia, messing around a little bit with Latin America. But then Africa, I mean, what was going on in contemporary African art? There were very few exhibitions. There was one that happened I think in Berlin, called Kunsthaus-Afrika, which was the Uli Bayer collection in the late 70s, had that catalogue. Otherwise, it was all masks. And I was someone had been talking to me here, and I've forgotten his name, unfortunately, about Makonde art. And then, completely out of the blue, by someone entirely different, I was approached by a collector, a guy called Moti Malda, who had been brought up, he was Asian, but he'd been brought up in Tanzania, and his family were traders. So he was sent off to go and sell the barbed wire and the wire netting and the grain and stuff that they did to the different villages and to the settlers. And he just started noticing this work, and he kept a record of it. He kept a record of everything he bought, the name of the person who made it, where it was bought, when it was bought, the title, and also the story that the person told about it. Now, this is absolutely rare, if not unique, in African art at this time. And also, it's art that is made to sell. It's not made for ritual tribal purposes. Earlier Makonde art is tobacco boxes, occasionally made for exchange with colonists, and masks. But these are objects made to sell with either settlers, colonists, or missionaries, who were the people going around there. And then, as it began to radicalize itself, particularly in Mozambique, they start to make these big social sculptures out of tree trunks, which Ujama, tree of life, but it also means a kind of village solidarity, a coming together against colonialism. And at the same time, Kusama Yayoi, soul-burning flashes. And that came, of course, out of that chair that you saw in the Reconstructions exhibition. Of having had exposure to her and to the work, it's obvious that this had to be seen more deeply. And then moving from Makonde to South Africa, again, some kind of connection here. in OUP told me that he knew of someone who'd just written a book published in South Africa on art of the townships. So I managed to get his address and said, well, what's going on? There must be things going on. I said, yes, there's a lot going on. It's not just in the townships either. The book was wrongly titled. The townships are where, outside the big cities where the black communities were concentrated under apartheid. But also there were a lot of rural artists as well, right up in the north and all over the place. So this led to a project in which I was working with UDF groups, UDF being United Democratic Front, who were accepted the legal version of the ANC in South Africa. And I also made contact with ANC here, with their representative in London, because there was a boycott, a cultural boycott. And we really didn't want to be in a position where we were breaking a boycott or to put artists in a bad position. But it was obvious by 1990 that the system was untenable, that there were so many good artists, that the work should be seen. And so he came up with the crazy idea of saying, we'll show the art of the new South Africa before it exists. And it took place in 1990. While I was working there, the ANC was unbanned, so it was all moving. The ANC itself, which was a Stalinist organization in its cultural attitudes, was fortunately leavened by one very bright man, a lawyer called Albie Sachs, came along to the opening, who had been severely disfigured by a bomb attack on him in South Africa. And he was actually arguing from inside the ANC that actually art should be free, that artists should be free, and it actually expresses the culture, all the cultures of the country. And as the ANC is non-racial, that included whites as well as blacks. And William Kentridge showed his films for the first time. He thought his films were rather sort of secondary to his drawings and should only be shown in cinemas. And he was a bit cross when I said I wanted to show his films. Anyway, he now realizes. And of course, what's been going on in Russia while all this has been happening, I mean, the whole place has been falling apart. And by the time this happens, I mean, the USSR is absolutely on the verge of extinction, if not already extinct. And so it was possible to get access through state purposes to good collections. And this was the first survey on this subject. Leonid Andreev was a very interesting writer before the revolution. And this autotype was a very early color photography. Pasternak's two sisters lived in Oxford. I knew quite well. Rodchenko again. And poor old Myholt. Because also what was coming out was the files from the KGB. And not only the admissions, confessions that people had been forced to sign under terrible duress, but also the last photographs. And Myholt was one of the most brilliant theatre directors of this time, and it suddenly figured in some of the earlier things that we had shown. And at this very point also, it's at last possible to show the official art, because we wouldn't do that before. And really to look at and how good is that? I mean, is it just purely propaganda? Is it all mouthpiece art? Well, there's been this long discussion in Britain, I mean, with Kitai, the human clay, about realism and non-realism, all of these things going on. And just to drop this into the question, And also as part of this exhibition, this work was in the show, Constantine Maximov, the artist who was invited by the Chinese in 1955 to come to China to teach them how to paint properly. Because in 1949, when Mao took over, I mean, he hadn't got a clue what kind of, I mean, he knew he didn't like the four olds, and certainly old art was one of them. And so what do you put in its place? Folk art? Well, yeah. Why not look at Russia? And at that time, in the 50s, China and Russia were still friends. They broke up big time in 1960-61. But Maximov, really, from the Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing, taught the Chinese how to paint. Huh. Semyon Chuikov, the one most successful Kyrgyz artist in the Soviet Academy. Gary Kozev. Really a great, there's some good paintings here. And then it starts satirizing itself. No, a poor catch. So this fisherman who's got a very small fish is being laughed at by the girls. Everyone knows it's not about his fish. And of course then was also conscious parody by artists like Ilya Kabakov and Eric Bulatov, this large portrait of Brezhnev called Brezhnev in the Crimea. Everyone knew who saw this work that Brezhnev had claimed that he was a big war hero in the Crimea during World War II. And everyone knew this was complete fabrication and lies. And what's more funny than to do a picture of him as this great leader? It's actually based on a famous portrait of Stalin, who did have some activity in the war, which one led to the winning of it, whereas this guy had none whatsoever. So it's a typically Soviet kind of irony. And yes, they did learn how to paint and make posters during the Cultural Revolution. But we didn't really want to dwell too much on that. We did a small exhibition of posters and also of ceramics from the Cultural Revolution down here. But since the Japanese show in '85, we've been trying to put together a picture of really what was happening in China post-1976, since the end of the Cultural Revolution. And we'd started to make some sense with it. We met the Ministry of Culture, and raising money was much more difficult. But by 1993, we did manage to put together two big shows, which one of the artists is here tonight who's in it. And reflecting this, which happened in 1989. And we got all the slides of all the works from this exhibition, and this happened in the Namok, National Museum, Art Museum of China, which is really close to Tiananmen Square, just 3 months before June the 4th. And then everything closed down. There was a complete cultural boycott between West and China until 1993. So we found that we were working on this area with a German group led by Hans van Dyck, who was working with the Hausdruckkultur in the Welt, and we were interested in some of the same works. And so we decided to do 2 exhibitions. We would go with the German selection, which was mainly of easel painting and a few small videos, but also we wanted to do some site-specific works, and also to reflect Chinese artists who'd left China before '89. Well, these works by Zhang Peili, actually one of the most famous video artists, but these are paintings which he made. And that's a painting he made which is related to a video called The Standard Pronunciation of 1989, in which the most famous newsreader, TV newsreader in China, reads out what are basically dictionary definitions. So it's just nonsense, or dictionary definitions, no more. And then he started making videos. This is one of the first. It's called Document on Hygiene, number 3, 1991, in which a man for about 15 minutes, washes a chicken. Now, it's absurd action, obviously, but it was also made at a time when, before people talked about avian flu, but there was a serious sort of flu going around at that time, affecting people's livers, which was not reported in the press. The thing is that a lot of people knew about it, and the reference was picked up about that as well. And then Mao goes pop. Yu Han's sort of pop images of Mao, so we're getting back at Andy Warhol, of course. A bit more interesting, actually. And then Wang Guanyi's endless series of sort of commercialized versions of the Cultural Revolution images. Or this incredible image, painting by Gong Zhengyi. Liu Feng. Yang Peiming and Gu Lixing. And then the Silent Energy new art from China. This was the site-specific work. Huang Yongping, very early work with him using animals. So there was 5,000 locusts inside these tents and 5 scorpions. So you had to walk in underneath them. And locusts doing what they do, they don't really live very long. They just die. They don't. So we weren't killing them. They just died. But Johnny Morris got very angry about it. I had a radio argument with Johnny Morris about the work. Chen Zhen, this work he made out in the yard of these burnt ashes. That's him, sadly passed away. And Sai Guocheng, it's one of his gunpowder drawings, and he did a live piece based on Halley's comet out on the university meadows, but unfortunately we ordered some rather slow fuse, so it took forever. It's supposed to happen in about 3 seconds, the whole thing, and fire off a balloon into the sky. So it took about 30 minutes, I think. I think health and safety had something to do with it. That's the top floor. So these guys got a long way very quick. Modernity, there was some modernity in the 20s in China and 30s, a little bit, particularly in Shanghai. There was woodblock prints in the Western style, Kater Kollwitz Expressionism and all of that. But really the explosion that took place in the 80s, both of knowledge and desire and activity, is phenomenal. And I'm very happy that we managed to reflect that at the time. Mrinali Mukherjee, one of the young Indian artists who we picked up from the earlier show. So just to including show that we just don't drop in and then leave it, but actually keep working with it alongside everything else. And that these are moments. So another history, a history of modernity in Argentina. And I guess this came out of the war, really, because the money was available to do it, because the Argentine side were interested in at least establishing some kind of cultural relations with Britain. And I was given a completely free hand and went out and had a look and said, look, if I'm not interested, I won't do anything. But then you look what you find when you start uncovering things. Luis Benedict did a big project in the Pit Rivers. These amazing people. Because actually, the 1960s, about 1960, the most interesting art cities in the world were New York, Tokyo, and Buenos Aires. There's so much live art going on. Now, there's not many history books that will tell you that. That's Luis Benedict. Signals from the End of the World, amazing work. And the photograph for the projection is of one of the last of the Yamane Indians from Tierra del Fuego. And it's set on about the colonization of Tierra del Fuego. So you have the gaze of a man from peoples who no longer exist. And also a dictionary in Welsh, a Welsh Yamani dictionary made by a Welsh missionary there, with a language which no one speaks any longer. And then Southeast Asia, I mean, because I was getting involved in this field more and more, I went to the first Art Asia Pacific Triennale in Brisbane in 1993, where they were working very hard in bringing people together. And contemporary Indonesian art I saw for the first time. So this is some installation made by Heri Dono at that time. And there it is in the Piper Gallery. And also a shadow puppet performance. So just as I was leaving, Chrissy Isles did this exhibition, Yoko Ono, which again follows off from the reconstruction. It actually took place after I'd left. But this was the beginning of the Yoko Ono revival, because she'd been, it was the first, before the Guggenheim show. And this, the famous Bottoms film, was shot by Victor Musgrave, who I worked with on the India Myth and Reality show. And then working with Howard Morphy in the Department of Social Anthropology, who were always great support, as were the Pitt Rivers people, this exhibition in place out of time of contemporary art in Australia. And this question, not only of folk art, this isn't folk art, this is a completely different culture, with its own rules, its own ideas. So, Alterity. Well, I'd just really like to wrap up by mentioning this exhibition, which has been curated and is traveling under the Hayward Touring banner, called Art from Elsewhere. And it was really put together from purchases made via the Art Fund by a selected group of galleries throughout the UK, with the possibility of buying stuff which they didn't know about. So they could either decide that they were going to research their collections and expand them, or they could actually start new ideas in their collections. They could expend the idea of what was contemporary in their collections. So there must have been about 300 or 400 things that they'd bought, and I got it down to about 120. And as the exhibition went to different places, different things were slotted in and out to really suit the venues and the exhibition spaces. Jyotish Kalat was a young Indian artist looking at floating labor force in Mumbai. Or Peter Hujar. I mean, the MIMA in Middlesbrough really, oh no, sorry, that's Glasgow. They really wanted to build up their photography collection, and this Peter Hujar was really documenting the AIDS crisis. I mean, started off not knowing he was, but in fact he became one of the main documenters of it in the 80s. Amazing series of photographs. Or Meshach Gaba, a work about value. It's called Brazilian Bank, and in it, as if out for sale, are all these currencies which are completely obsolete. They all have no value, sort of thing. But I think in this, he's parodying the kind of idea of an African roadside stall, but also the idea of money itself, or what it symbolizes. Well, there are all these different countries and symbolisms of their leaders and their national symbols. It's all very grand, it's all very aggressive, yet this stuff doesn't worth anything. And there's a question also about whether money is worth anything. I mean, what does it represent? I mean, it represents basically something because enough people think it does. But say, look at 2008 differently. This was made in 2006. But look at 2008 differently and say, well, actually, does one keep the system quite the same as it is? I mean, what are we backing up? Are we backing up just incompetence of speculation which is not backed up by assets, or what? And what are assets in such circumstances? Now, African artists weren't supposed to ask that kind of question. I mean, but they do now. And I was involved in 2003-04 in a large exhibition called Art from South Africa, which I asked Simon Jami to curate, be the chief curator of, which traveled around. Came to the Hayward, I think, one of its many venues. Imran Qureshi, standing figure in camouflage. Kara Walker's Girl, that's relating to Hurricane Katharina. Carl Andre's Passport, a collection of books bought by Middlesbrough, which are poems by Carl Andre, a lot of them referring to early moments in American colonization, in the colonization of America. Nairobi's Ton of Tea. And then just lastly, to wrap up, the last large project I've been involved in is called The Pleasure of Love. It's in Belgrade, Serbia. It seemed to be the perfect subject, but it's the first line of a French song written before the French Revolution called Plaisir d'amour. The pleasure of love lasts only a moment. The grief of love lasts your whole life through. Well, it's a proposition. It's not necessarily one I agree with, but it is a proposition which normalizes oppression or grief or misery for the majority. And it starts, it's in a military academy built about 1905, which is right next to an area which was bombed by NATO in the end of the 90s, so there's bomb sites all around. You see it's rather charmingly dilapidated. The tall guy is Via Lewandowski, a German artist, and Franziska Klutz, a German painter next to him. And playing is Susan Phillips. It's called Two Sisters. It's her version. She's singing two versions of an old Scottish and Irish ballad about sororicide, about one sister killing the other sister out of jealousy over a man. Body falls into the river, is washed down, and is found on the riverbank by a traveling fiddler. The flesh is washed off the bones, so he takes the bones and he makes a violin out of them. Out of her nose, she makes the bridge of the fiddle. Out of the hair, the strings. And it sets out to play a song. But the only song it will sing is "Oh, the dreadful wind and rain, oh, the dreadful wind and rain," which is the refrain of the song which, in this fragmented way, Susan Phillips is singing. That's called Honey, Honey. It's by Via Lewandowski. Injured Parties, part of their Museum of Childhood by Vladimir Milica Peric. A large wall drawing called Fragile Presence, which is relating to the refugee crisis, which we all know about, but which is very keenly felt in against the Hungarian border where they are. Kentridge, a young Belgian artist called Kathy Letting Go. And then a young Finnish artist, Venus. This is a self-portrait, but she's wearing large prosthetics, as you can see, which are usually purchased by men who are actually undergoing gender assignation or as transvestites. That's all for now. Lots of different kinds of alterity. Thank you. If there are any questions, I'll be delighted. It's just on the hour.
I'll pass the mic to him.
I don't need a microphone, I can get around. No, when you started, you said that currently artists are essentially free from the patrons, whether they're the church, the state, the aristocracy. And an artist can basically do what they want. But in my mind, the power has shifted. There's a massive international filtration system. And you're very much a part of that. That's why we're here tonight listening to you. And you make a decision, and it's a mystery to me how you decide who is going to be in this gallery, who you're going to have in the exhibition that you're doing at the moment. Mm. Now, that to me gives you a lot of power. We depend on you. And then when you go to galleries, say MoMA in New York, you'll find people like Andre or the Walker Woman or Yoko Ono or Donald Judd. By the way, the Spring Street Gallery, you can go in there, but you need to book. That's really worthwhile. But then you get a certain number of people who are known throughout the international world. And you mentioned African art, Eastern art, Japanese art. We depend on you to tell us about that. How do you decide? Who tells you?
No one tells me.
Nobody tells you. You make the decision yourself, but somebody has to bring the artist to your notice. And my question is, how do you find out about them?
Well, it's a very broad brush. I mean, and as you probably noticed, that what I've been telling you is a kind of madness. Because you've been seeing not quite the universe, but the world in a grain of sand in this building, a large part of it. But it's possible. And I guess what got me going, which I omitted to say in the 70s, was that I felt very uneasy that, of course, I started off learning, and if you're a young curator, you want to do well, you're ambitious, it's sort of norm. And the pressures are on you to conform. And so I started looking at, well, lots of things, but say Judd was a good example. I mean, he's someone who was quite good from a number of points of view. No one could disagree with him, really. Although I stand by the work. So it's a good starting point. But at that very, very time, the whole kind of art system starts to implode. The whole idea of progressive series of movements. I mean, artists didn't use these words, but I mean everyone else did. Minimalism, conceptualism, dematerialization of the art object. So all of a sudden, you're almost left with nothing. And also it was getting more and more conformist as well. There was a terrible conformism about that. And that fell apart when, really two reasons as far as I can work out, is that the whole idea of avant-garde died sometime in the mid-70s. No longer, you could talk about it earlier, and it had some kind of meaning. And isms, one thing succeeded another, a kind of positivist, progressive idea. And that no longer existed, and it coincided with liberalization of economies, world economies, and there was a lot of money around all of a sudden, and people started being interested in contemporary art. And the whole idea of a return to painting, spirit was the word, the new spirit was the title of an exhibition in London. And so from looking at really quite a strict, almost ascetic view of contemporary art, there was in this anything goes. And the final straw for me was the trans avant-garde, the young Italians, who were not particularly young and not particularly interesting, I thought. But anyway, how could it be that everyone was looking at one kind of art, one of this is all great. And then the next time, there's this huge shift. And say George Baselitz. I mean, Baselitz had been making work since the early 60s. And hardly anyone, even in Germany, had been taking much notice of it. He did have a certain following in Germany. But I think it's 1979 exhibition in Eindhoven But Baselitz was suddenly shown, and Rudy Fuchs showed him, who'd been showing all the others, and Gilbert and George, whatever. I mean, Snake shows Baselitz, so this is kind of new spirit, new painting. And there's a big, big shift. It happens very, very quickly. And I just got very, very wary that if he's good now, he's been making work for nearly 20 years, why didn't we know about it earlier? So this had something to do with looking, and where you look. And that's really why I started looking around. And I didn't trust the Western system. And any the contemporary art was, as I said, it was Western European and North American. It's ludicrous. It's part of a small part of the world. But it was part of the world that had money. And so the idea that art, contemporary art, was not being made anywhere where there wasn't money to buy it, again, didn't seem to me to be supportable. And as we moved from here, from that time, 40 years ago, it was talked about modern, contemporary and modern were more or less interchangeable, but one didn't use the word contemporary so much. Now the word contemporary, I like it a lot, because all it means is made work made now. It's contemporary. So that original artist's work is as contemporary as anything, Damien Hirst. No, it doesn't mean it's good or bad or whatever. If you said it's modern, it always meant it was kind of good. Or to be retarded, to be, what's the word they use? I can't remember. There's a particular critical word which means relatedness in art. Yeah, Okoye Glaser goes on a lot about this. To be belated. Well, yeah, it wants to be belated, but is it actually belated? So the question in contemporary art is not if it's modern, not if it's one thing or the other. Is it any good? Is it worth spending time looking at? And that is the job for anyone like me and any artists themselves, actually. But I have to do with whole bunches of artists. Is it any good? Am I prepared to spend some time thinking, reflecting on this? Would I want to see it ever again? And that goodness can be defined and thought of in many, many different ways. Sometimes it's beautiful, sometimes it's horrible, sometimes it's frustrating and sends you crazy almost. It's still good. It won't go away. And that's what makes art powerful and different from other things. And I think a lot of artists are trying to work to remove the barriers which make art and to do what Mayakovsky was, make the streets your brushes, the squares your palette. Well, as soon as you do that, art's no longer special because it's every day. And that specialness is so important. And I think the public galleries have to work to preserve that specialness and actually talk about that specialness. Because that's what they can do, rather than be subject to market and fashion and wanting to look trendy all the time. There's no need. Nothing more sad than trying to look trendy. Does that answer, sort of?
Yes, and thank you for so many people in the 20 years that you were here.
Well, I enjoyed it too. Lots of us. The little altruism.
Something or share some of their memories of shows that they saw here at that time.
Can I just say something? I worked here. I worked here as Abby Nairn's PA for 3 years. One of the best 3 years of my life in a working environment. Great fun, amazing art, amazing people I work with. And I am from Oxford, and I did used to come here when I was much younger. But I absolutely had no idea about the depth of your, the breadth of your programme, as it were. And I've done lots of travelling since, and I just think it's absolutely wonderful what you did. And I think you were unique, in my opinion, to to be so just scanning the globe and not following the crowd of whatever anybody else in London is doing. I don't know. I mean, that's my opinion, but I just thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, it would be quite dull to follow what everyone else is doing.
Directors here have tried to follow suit, and many of them very successfully, but I just think that you've just done an amazing job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Could I make a request then? For any, could I make a request then that anybody who knows the intricacies of Wikipedia, it's something that I try to avoid, but over the last few years I've looked at the Modern Art Oxford website, or the reference in Wikipedia, and looked interestedly at the history of the Museum of Modern Art, which existed before Modern Art Oxford. And I found the Wikipedia reference curious because of the manner in which it has been edited. And a few years ago, I just thought that the 20 years that David's just been referring to appeared to have been virtually eliminated from the references on Wikipedia. If anybody knows how it is possible to remedy that, so that some degree of balance is achieved on something like a Wikipedia entry for Modern Art Oxford and Museum Modern Art, I would like to congratulate them. I don't want to do it because I'm kind of tired with David Brush. But anybody who's untainted by such close associations with 30 Pembroke Street as me, if anybody else can do it, I would love it. That's all.
Andrew.
Yeah, I probably don't need a microphone.
It's recorded.
Right, okay. I just wanted to reiterate what Sarah was saying at the front. Your contribution has been amazing here, absolutely amazing, and it's been a pleasure to actually sit around so many of the shows when I first started working here. Just wonderful shows, and to continue. And I wanted to ask a question, which I think I asked you when you came in the other day, was about how you felt that Brexit would affect the arts in Britain. What you might have to say about that. That's what I wanted to ask. But thank you for such a wonderful evening as well.
Well, I think the political discourse has to improve from that particular campaign. I mean, it was when you fight a party campaign, you expect lies on both sides. And I think the lies were just so egregious in this non-party referendum that, you know, return to Little Britain, Little England? No. Will the Americans bail us out? No. Will the Commonwealth give us a helping hand? Very unlikely. No, I mean we're part of Europe and an important part of Europe, and a lot of my friends are so upset and feel disappointed that this has happened. Now that the Conservative Party is talking about intervening and having a proper policy as a government, which is, I think it's quite right that government should have policies, proper policies, but I can't imagine they'll have one, but we'll see. Perhaps they want to interfere in culture. But I can't imagine how they would do that. I mean, what culture needs is money so it can get on and work. And there's lots of private initiatives, and they're very necessary, but also there needs to be the public collections, like public services and resources and libraries. They need public money to run. And they build up the fabric and culture and discourse in the whole country. And I benefited from them as a child and as a young person, and I really shudder if young people now don't. But we're supposed to live in a democracy, so I mean, I think we have to do something about it. And moving back to Britain to live here mostly. So I'll be doing my little bit, but it started in the 80s, and I mean the Brexit vote was a vote of anger and blaming migrants for what politicians have been doing for the past 20 to 30 years, basically, in my view, as you asked me.
Just sort of on the grounds that struggle can often be more instructive than success. I was wondering if there were any particular exhibitions where you remember you had difficulty actually putting it together into something coherent, or where there was a particular struggle that you had during the time.
Yeah, most of those exhibitions were quite difficult, but I got it wrong a couple of times, and it wasn't what I wanted, or I'd actually had a kind of fancy idea about something and it was wrong, and that was really awful. But I'm not going to say which. I fucked up. Yeah, on a sort of very basic level. It looked okay. A lot of people didn't notice, but it was actually lousy. And sometimes it happens, and particularly when you're working with live art. But this was, yeah. Anyway, you should make sure it doesn't, and that's part of that's my job, to make sure it doesn't. So. Yeah. But the kind of complications and the machinations and all the rest of it, somehow it worked out, both politically and financially. And you find funny allies. The Conservative arts ministers were much better than the Labour ones, funnily enough. But they actually had a reasonable education and didn't think that art was instrumental of something, whereas the Labour lot have tried to make art a tool of something all the time. And social use, it's bloody useless, but that's the point, the beauty of it.
So following that point about art being very useless, does anybody have any further points they want to make?
I would just like to know how you feel about the change in the title from a museum to not a museum.
Well, if it ain't broke, why fix it? It's my view. I mean, there was an irony to the title, of course, because there's hardly a collection, there's little bits. And as I say, we were doing rather well at showing the universe in a grain of sand here. And Oxford's a place where you can do that, in that it's the most provincial city in the world, but also the most cosmopolitan. And yeah, I'm kind of quite strict when I'm quoted, or the references when people say I was working at Modern Art Oxford. I say, no way. Museum of Modern Art Oxford. And that matters to me, but no reason it should matter to anyone else. Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for asking me.